He didn't have to have any legal training, because we don't need legal training. We don't need previous precedent and previous law. All we need is somebody with a good communist revolutionary conscience who knows how to mete out communist justice in one case after another. In fact, one government official said to the Russian leader Lenin, "Our Commissariat of Justice really should be renamed the Commissariat of Social Extermination, shouldn't it?" And Lenin said, "Yes, it should, but we can't say that." So that's how they come up with crimes like falling demonstratively on your knees. A revolutionary judge simply makes this stuff up as he goes along. So the first show trials in Russia were not under Stalin, when Stalin would take potential political rivals or fellow communists and put them on trial and accuse them of treachery and force them to engage in ridiculous and obviously absurd confessions. Those are sometimes thought of as the first show trials, where the job was to humiliate the accused before executing him. The first show trials were actually under Lenin, when priests were put on trial for having defended their property or having carried out the simplest and most benign of priestly functions. The job was to humiliate and break these people. And yet again, this is forgotten. This is beyond forgotten. What about Spain in the 20th century during the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939? What happened there? In terms of Catholics, we have some of the most grotesque atrocities carried out by people. For example, one historian tells us, in Spain, which of course is one of Europe's most staunchly Catholic countries, large numbers of Catholics were just butchered solely for being Catholic. Unlike the martyrdoms in most parts of the world, whole sectors of the religious community were liquidated. At least 6,832 priests and religious were martyred, including 13 bishops. In the 20th century, probably no country witnessed so much bloodshed among its clergy. Another source, an incalculable number of laypersons were killed because of their religious associations, either as well-known churchgoers, members of fraternal and charitable religious organizations, or as the fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, and friends of clerics. Some were killed because they professed their faith by wearing some outward symbol of belief, perhaps a religious medal or a scapular. Some were killed for acts of charity, for granting refuge to clerics attempting to escape this terrible fury. It is impossible to determine the number of these laypersons who were slain for their faith. And nor was the anti-clericalism limited to killing. Thousands of churches were burned, religious objects were profaned, nuns' tombs were opened, and the petrified mummies displayed to ridicule, and religious ceremonies were burlesqued. Indeed, practically any imaginable anti-clerical act was not only possible, but likely. And still another writer tells us, as they entered a village, that is, in effect, anti-Catholic stormtroopers, you may as well call them, their first object of attack was the church. There, the communists and their henchmen would round up the priests and religious, as well as anyone who protested, wreak all kinds of destruction and sacrilege, and then pour round after round of ammunition into the tabernacle of the parish church. Now, unfortunately, my friends, we could go on and on. We could talk about the sacrifices Catholics made under the terrible Nazi regime, about the thousands of priests interned at Dachau. We could talk about the sufferings in Mexico. There's so much we can talk about because there were sufferings all over the world in the 20th century. In Africa, all over the world, people perished because of their faith. Now, unfortunately, this is largely a forgotten story. The Black Book of Communism does tell a lot of the atrocities of the communists, and that is a very important thing because people, in effect, don't seem to care or have forgotten about these crimes. But that book doesn't really give us the information we might want about people who died specifically because they were Catholics and not just because they were anti-communist. So the book I would recommend is a book by Robert Royal, called Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century. Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century. And he gives a history of what happened in the 20th century around the world. And he says that in terms of people we can clearly identify as having specifically died for the faith, it's in the hundreds of thousands. We can't forget those people. And these are people who gave the same witness as those people in the early centuries who helped their own persecutors. These are people who, when they died, they forgave these people and they blessed them. That's why Tertullian said, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians, because people are so moved by their testimony. Pope John Paul II quoted the words of Christ, "Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven." And the Pope said, how well these words of Christ fit the countless witnesses to the faith in the last century, insulted and persecuted, but never broken by the power of evil. Where hatred seemed to corrupt the whole of life, leaving no escape from its logic, they proved that love is stronger than death. Within terrible systems of oppression which disfigured man, in places of pain, amid the hardest of privations, through senseless marches, exposed to cold and hunger, tortured, suffering in so many ways, they loudly proclaimed their loyalty to Christ crucified and risen. Countless numbers refused to yield to the cult of the false gods of the 20th century and were sacrificed by communism, Nazism, by the idolatry of state or race. Many others fell in the course of ethnic or tribal wars because they had rejected a way of thinking foreign to the gospel of Christ. Some went to their death because, like the Good Shepherd, they decided to remain with their people despite intimidation. On every continent and throughout the entire 20th century, there have been those who preferred to die rather than betray the mission which was theirs. And they did so in the spirit of Christ. But their stories have been forgotten. We need to remember them, because these stories can inspire, and they in fact can move people to conversion. Well, next time, we're going to wrap up our series and look at what the Church has done for the West and how we can tell more people about it. So join me next time. Thanks.